Hey there. Welcome back to the quiet side of time. Tonight, the Vltava rests beneath its bridges, and somewhere in the old quarter, a door creaks in a room that has not been entered for years. Dim the lights. Let the breath fall into a slower rhythm. Let the mind loosen its grip on the day. If calm stories like this help you rest, you may let the thought of returning linger in the corner of the mind. I have saved something rare for the very end, and it begins now, in silence. Before the day woke, before wheels touched cobblestone, Prague was a city suspended in a slow breath. The Vltava lay dark, like a length of silk draped across the valley, its surface unbroken except for the occasional ripple where a fish rose briefly, then vanished. The bridges, still damp with night mist, stood like patient sentinels over the water, stone arches holding centuries in their quiet weight. The air was cool, and it moved in narrow streets where shadows clung like memory. Behind shuttered windows, ovens kept their slow vigil, their warmth spilling into the wood frames, carrying the faint, sweet scent of rising dough. Somewhere in the Jewish quarter, a watchman leaned on his staff, listening for nothing in particular. Prague's mornings in the late 17th century did not begin with haste. The city was still more candle than lamp, more hoofbeat than wheel. By this hour, the night watch had already walked its last round along the city walls, checking gates, testing locks, and marking the hour by horn or rattle. The Charles Bridge stood empty, but for the faint trace of dew, and the statues along its length seemed almost to breathe under their thin veil of moisture. The castle on the hill was only a shadow in the half-light, its towers folded in mist. From that high ground, the city below looked like a darkened map of its own making. Islands of light from the last candles, threads of alleyways woven between stone houses. In the old town square, the astronomical clock waited for the sun to give it meaning again. Its painted face, with its deep blues and golds, was invisible in the gloom, though the gears behind it never truly rested. It was a time before chimneys smoked in earnest. Only the bakeries gave themselves away. Their fires banked through the night, so the morning would not begin cold. The bread made here was dark and hearty, its crust thick enough to last for days. Grain came in sacks from surrounding villages, brought over the river on small barges, or carried by cart along muddy roads. A good loaf could be traded for milk, for salt, or for a small candle, each exchange a quiet thread in the city's daily weave. The streets still carried traces of the night before: a tipped bucket, a trail of ash where the wind had scattered it, the faint metallic scent where a horseshoe had struck stone. From time to time, an early riser might pass, a brewer's apprentice on his way to stir the vats, a woman with a shawl drawn close, carrying herbs to sell before the sun grew warm. Even in these early hours, the cobblestones kept the sound of footsteps small, as if the city preferred not to wake too suddenly. To the east, beyond the walls, fields lay under a pale mist. In the orchards, dew hung from branches like tiny beads of glass. The harvest this year had been fair, though not without worry. The summer rains had come late, and the Moldau's waters had risen higher than some remembered. The river could be a giver or a taker, and the people of Prague lived in quiet respect of both. From certain doorways, religious icons looked out, paintings darkened by smoke, or small carved figures set into the walls. They caught the first trace of morning light as if the day's blessings needed a place to land before the city stirred. Church bells would not ring for some time yet. Their silence was part of the night's final hours, a space where thought could drift without measure. Somewhere in Malastrana, a scholar's candle still burned. His ink had dried in the well, and the page before him was half filled with Latin script that leaned in the quiet way of tired hands. Books lay in careful disorder on the table, volumes on astronomy, on ancient law, on the alchemy of metals. Outside his window, the street was empty, but for the occasional cat, its eyes reflecting the candlelight before vanishing into shadow. Above the rooftops, the sky began to pale, though the first true light was still held back by the hills. This was the city's most private hour, the moment when its history seemed to hum underfoot, when the air itself carried the texture of parchment and stone. Each brick, each wooden beam, had been set by hands now long gone, yet still holding their place in the living body of the city. It was easy, in this hush, to imagine Prague as it had been a century before, or a century before that. The streets were narrower then, the roofs lower, and the river less bridged. But the pattern was always the same, a slow gathering of movement from dark to light, from silence to the first scatter of sound, and always the same river, the same turning of the water under stone, the same mist settling like breath over its surface. The first gull wheeled overhead, its call thin against the stillness. Somewhere in the distance, a single cart creaked into motion. The sound reached the walls of the city, slipped through a gate, and found its way into the sleeping streets. Soon, the day would open its eyes. The market square would fill, and the bells would pull the air into movement. But here, in this narrow stretch of time, the city belonged to its shadows, its stone, its water. It was in this space, before the first loaf was sold, before the court scribes took up their pens, before the small tensions of the day began, that certain thoughts could rise without being named. Thoughts that lingered in the shape of the old laws, waiting for a moment to be spoken. And in that hush, in the folds of the city's shadow, the ink of a different kind of record was already beginning to dry. In the stillness of the castle's inner chambers, law was not a voice, but a presence. It slept on parchment, folded, stacked, sealed, waiting for the moment a hand would disturb the dust. The air here smelled faintly of wax and ink, and of the slow decay of paper kept too long in the dark. By the 17th century, Prague's laws had grown into a layered thing, stitched together from royal decrees, old town charters, and older customs that no scribe had ever written down. They did not always agree. One statute might promise mercy, where another demanded severity. The result was less a single, clear river than a tangle of smaller streams, some of them choked with weeds. The court records were written in a careful hand, often Latin for the formal charges, German for trade disputes, and Czech for the witness statements of the common people. Every shift in language was a shift in power. The accused might not understand the words spoken over them, might nod in agreement to a phrase that sealed their fate. The statutes that governed the city were kept in heavy-bound volumes, their covers pressed leather, their corners reinforced with dull brass. When opened, the pages released a faint sound, like a breath taken after long restraint. Each letter was sharp and deliberate, formed with the belief that to write a law well was to make it last. Laws against theft and violence were clear enough, but there were other articles, vague and shadowed, drawn from older fears, prohibitions on charms and amulets, on speaking certain words over bread or milk, on drawing symbols in the dirt outside another's home. Such lines had been copied from earlier codes, themselves borrowed from even older towns and villages. By the time they reached this chamber, their origins were more superstition than statute. In the courtrooms below, these laws did not arrive like thunder. They arrived in whispers: a neighbor's complaint, a merchant's accusation, a midwife's name spoken with unease. They moved upward through the city's offices, collected like rainwater, until the clerk of the court entered them into the formal record. The scribes who worked here had a quiet authority. Their desks were lit by narrow windows during the day and by tallow candles when the sun fell. Each pen stroke had to be steady, for a slip could alter meaning. They wore simple wool, with dark stains of ink in the creases of their cuffs. One might pause mid-sentence, warming stiff fingers over the small brazier in the corner, before returning to a line about punishment or proof. The laws moved slowly because the city moved slowly. Petitions might wait weeks before being heard. Messengers carried summonses across cobbled streets, through markets and under gates, pausing to rest their feet on cold mornings. In winter, when snow filled the alleys, the delivery of justice slowed to almost nothing, and unresolved cases lay dormant until the thaw. Still, there was a rhythm to it. Witnesses called, questions asked in the same order, oaths sworn over the same cross or relic. The notary's quill made its way down the page, trailing ink like a thin stream through sand. Beneath all this written order, a different current moved, one that could not be found in the bound volumes. It was the old belief that misfortune had a human cause, that illness in a child, a failed crop, or a spoiled barrel of beer must be the work of someone's ill will. The law might dress such fears in formal language, but their roots reached deeper than the court's authority. When such cases came before the magistrates, the room changed. The usual disputes, over land boundaries or the quality of a shipment, were replaced by quieter charges. Suspicion of harmful magic, possession of forbidden objects, unnatural dealings with animals. The words were careful, but everyone in the room understood their weight. The magistrates were not always eager to pass judgment. Some saw such accusations as a waste of the court's time, others as a matter too dangerous to ignore. And so the old laws sat like loaded dice in the corner of the table, waiting to be cast when the mood shifted. Occasionally, a case would rise high enough in profile to be entered in the annals of the city. These entries were sparse, no more than a name, a date, a brief description of the charge, and the sentence. The human details were left unrecorded. Whether the accused had spoken in their own defense, whether they had wept or kept silence, whether they had cursed the court or bowed to it. These things lived only in the memory of those present. In time, the older statutes would be revised or erased, their stranger prohibitions quietly dropped. But for now, they remained part of the city's legal body, ready to be invoked by anyone who knew how to pull their weight. All it took was a clerk with a steady hand and a magistrate with the will to listen. The chamber itself was not grand. The plaster was cracked in places, the wooden floor worn smooth where chairs had scraped for decades. The warmth from the brazier never quite reached the far corners. In those dim spaces, the shelves of statutes and decrees leaned under their own mass, like trees bending in a slow wind. And somewhere in those shelves, between the rules of trade and the measures of grain, were the words that would one day reach into the life of a woman living quietly in a narrow street. The ink was already dry. The lines were already set. And while the candlelight trembled on the edges of the page, a clerk closed one book and reached for another, the volume that would hold her name. The courtroom was not grand. Its walls were pale and bare, its air touched with the faint smell of damp stone and smoke. A single window let in a slice of late autumn light, falling in a thin rectangle across the wooden table where the clerk sat waiting with his pen. It was the year 1715, and the trials that had once burned hot across Europe were cooling into their final embers. Yet the old laws still slept in the shelves above, ready to be woken when the right whisper passed through the city. The magistrates entered without ceremony, their boots marking a steady rhythm on the boards. One adjusted his cuffs, another glanced at the papers already laid out. No one spoke unnecessarily. The room seemed to absorb sound rather than carry it. The accused woman was led in by a guard. She was not in chains. Her hands rested loosely before her, the knuckles reddened from cold. Her dress was plain, wool worn thin at the elbows, patched where the hem had frayed. She kept her eyes low, not from shame, but as though the effort of looking up was more than the hour deserved. A name was asked. It was given in a quiet voice, and the clerk bent over his page. The nib of the quill scratched softly as it moved, cutting her into the record. The ink spread slightly in the rough fibers, a small shadow blooming outward from each letter. The charges were read in the formal order: use of charms to influence health, possession of herbs beyond the common trade, and the keeping of a black rooster said to crow at unnatural hours. No act of violence was named. No victim was present. The words floated in the still air, stripped of the heat that might have clung to them in the street. Such accusations were rare now, but not yet unthinkable. The plague years were not so far behind, and the city's memory of hunger still lived in its bones. When illness came without cause, when milk soured too quickly, when a child woke screaming in the night, there were still those who would search for a human shape to blame. The magistrates listened without interruption. The witnesses spoke in low voices, their hands folded or fidgeting in their laps. One described seeing her gather plants by moonlight. Another recalled that she muttered to herself when she walked alone. A third swore that his cow had given no milk after she had passed along the lane. The accused said little. When asked directly, she admitted to keeping herbs, rosemary, rue, wormwood, but only for steeping in broth or brewing for fever. She spoke of the rooster as any farmer might, a bird that came by barter, kept for its vigilance against rats. Her words were neither defensive nor pleading. They were the plain speech of someone accustomed to saying only what was needed. The scribe wrote each exchange in his slow, deliberate script. His desk was marked with faint grooves where the pressure of years of writing had shaped the wood. The page before him filled steadily, the lines pressed close together like rows in a narrow field. At the top, under the date and location, her name was the first thing written, and would be the last of its kind to appear in this court. No one in that moment knew it would be the final time such a charge was entered into Prague's records. History does not announce its endings. It leaves them to be discovered later in the quiet turning of a page in an archive. Outside, The day moved as it always did. The river kept its steady path under the bridges. Bakers drew loaves from their ovens, the crusts crackling in the cool air. Merchants called to one another as they set their goods in place. Nothing in the city's hum suggested that inside one small chamber, a centuries-old fear was being given its last, faint echo. The trial did not run long. The magistrates withdrew for a time, their footsteps retreating down the narrow hall. The accused sat without speaking, her hands folded in her lap. From somewhere beyond the walls came the sound of a cart passing, the uneven rhythm of wheels over stone. When the judges returned, the verdict was spoken without emphasis. Banishment from the city for a period of 3 years. No flames, no gallows, only removal, as though distance itself could cleanse suspicion. It was a sentence meant to close the matter quietly, without drawing the heat of public curiosity. The scribe wrote the final line. He sanded the page lightly, tilting it to let the excess grains fall away. The ink was dry now, settled deep into the paper's weave. He placed the sheet with the others, stacked neatly for binding. When the woman was led out, her shadow passed briefly over the table. The candle flame trembled, then steadied again. The room returned to its pale stillness. The magistrates left, their boots once again marking that slow, unhurried rhythm. The clerk gathered his quills, straightened the inkwell, and began preparing for the next case, a dispute over the boundary of 2 gardens. And yet, the weight of that name lingered in the air, even as the dust began to settle again on the shelves above. In years to come, no other name would follow hers in such a charge. The old fear had finally grown too thin to hold shape. But for now, the record lay closed on the table, its edges rough beneath the clerk's hand. Outside, the day had brightened, the city already busy with the work of ordinary life. The bridges stood, the river ran, and somewhere in the outskirts, a black rooster lifted its head to crow. And beyond the walls, in a small garden left untended, the herbs still turned their leaves toward the light. Before the accusations, the woman's world was a small square of the city. It lay just beyond the market's edge, where the sound of traders' cries thinned into the quiet of narrow lanes. Houses here leaned gently toward each other, their walls patched with decades of repairs, timbers darkened by the smoke of countless winters. Her home was a single-room dwelling with a low-beamed ceiling. In winter, the fire never burned more than a soft glow. Wood was too dear to spend freely. A clay jug stood near the hearth, always filled with water drawn from the pump at dawn. The air inside was a mingling of earth, dried rosemary, and the faint mineral scent of damp plaster. Her mornings began before the bells. She would tie her hair back with a strip of linen, pull on the woolen shawl that had been her mother's, and step into the cold street with a basket on her arm. The baker would nod as she passed, sometimes offering the heel of a loaf, hard but still warm at its center. At the pump, she met others in the blue light of early day. Their talk was not of grand events, but of a neighbor's cough, a chicken gone missing, a price that had risen again since the week before. The rope creaked as she pulled the bucket upward, and the water's surface trembled in the cold air before settling. By mid-morning, she was often in the garden behind her dwelling. It was no more than a patch of soil edged by a leaning fence, but there she grew the plants that anchored her days: sage, marjoram, rue, chamomile, and a few hardy stalks of wormwood, whose silvery leaves held the dawn frost longer than the others. She knew when each would flower, when to cut them for drying, and which stems to leave untouched for next season. The black rooster was her only animal. It strutted through the garden with a measured pride, scratching at the soil for beetles, its feathers holding a deep sheen even in weak light. Sometimes it crowed at midday, which the neighbors noted with faint amusement, until amusement shifted, as such things sometimes did. Her work was not mysterious. She washed linens for 2 households, kneeling by the tub until her hands numbed in the cold water. She carried bundles to dry on lines strung between buildings, their whiteness catching what sunlight the street allowed. She mended worn sleeves for a seamstress, paid not in coins, but in scraps of cloth and the promise of bread. When she cooked, it was in a small iron pot. Broth thickened with barley, onions softened until they collapsed into sweetness. In summer, she added greens from the market. In winter, she stirred in dried herbs and let the scent fill the room in place of any richer fare. She ate alone, her back to the wall, listening to the faint murmur of her neighbors beyond the thin boards. Evenings were the quietest. The streets narrowed further in the dark, shadows drawn out between the uneven stones. Candles were burned sparingly. Often she worked by the coal's glow alone, her needle flashing briefly each time it caught the light. Some nights she traded eggs from the rooster's hens for a stub of tallow or a pinch of salt. The exchanges were brief, words measured like the goods themselves. She kept a small book in the chest at the foot of her bed. Its cover was worn smooth, its pages filled with handwriting that was not hers. It had belonged to her grandmother, a record of planting dates, weather notes, and recipes for broths and infusions. Some were for common colds, others for fevers or aching joints. The ingredients were simple: herbs, honey, vinegar, a careful note on when to administer and when to let the illness pass untroubled. From time to time, a neighbor came quietly to her door. A child's cough, a mother's restless sleep, a burn from the baker's oven. She would listen, select a sprig or two from her bundles hung in the rafters, and wrap them in cloth. Payment was never spoken of directly. Sometimes a loaf left on her step, sometimes nothing at all. The city around her was changing in small, steady ways. The market grew busier each year. Foreign coins appeared more often in the traders' hands. Some houses in her quarter were repaired with new stone, others left to sag into the earth. The sound of carts over the bridge carried farther into the night, as though the river itself had begun to speak more often. Her life passed mostly unmarked. Days folded into each other, shaped by weather, by the turning of seasons, by the small cycles of planting, washing, mending. She had no reason to think herself notable, and perhaps that was true, until a sickness lingered in one household longer than expected, until a cow gave less milk, until someone remembered the rooster's odd crow. The first whispers did not reach her directly. They passed along market benches, in the pause after a greeting, in the turning away of eyes. When she noticed, she met it with the same stillness she brought to every task. If she feared, it was a quiet, private fear, kept beneath the fold of her shawl. The days before her summons to court were no different to any stranger watching from a distance. The pump still creaked, the garden still gave its herbs, the rooster still moved in slow arcs across the soil. Yet the air had shifted, a faint tension, like the hush before a winter storm that no one wanted to name. The paper with her name already waited, though she did not know it. The quill was ready. The ink would soon be poured. But for a little longer, there was only the quiet rhythm of her ordinary life. And in the rafters above her bed, the bundles of drying herbs hung motionless, holding their scent for whatever winter would bring. It began with no announcement, no ringing of bells, no sudden change in the sound of the streets. The first words were quiet enough to be mistaken for idle conversation. A name, softly placed into the air, left to drift toward the ears that might pass it along. In the kitchens of narrow houses, the talk slipped between the chopping of roots and the stirring of broth. A neighbor leaning in to share what she had heard from a cousin who had heard it from a baker's wife. The rhythm of the spoon kept steady, but the eyes of the listener stilled. It was not the words themselves, but the way they arrived, slanted, unfinished, heavy with invitation. Doorways became small theaters for the exchange. Two women with aprons dusted in flour spoke across the threshold, their bodies angled to block the sight of passers-by. One hand rested on the doorframe, the other tightened around a folded cloth. In these brief meetings, sentences were rarely completed. A raised brow replaced a question. A tilt of the chin served as agreement. In the market, gossip moved with the goods. It traveled in the pause before a coin was placed, in the moment when a fishmonger wrapped his catch a little more slowly than needed. A handful of dried peas became a measure of suspicion, poured from one palm to another, as though the motion itself could seal the truth. The city streets, crooked and uneven, were perfect for such exchanges. Sound carried strangely there. Words slipped through shutters, drifted over low walls, merged with the creak of carts and the calls of traders. A remark left in one corner could arrive in another, shaped by each mouth that passed it along. Children heard more than they were meant to. They played in the gaps between houses, chasing each other through alleys where the voices of adults came in fragments. They learned to repeat only parts, the ones that drew a laugh or a gasp, and so the stories bent further. By evening, a gesture meant to explain might return as an accusation. The taverns were quieter than the streets in daylight, but their nights were thick with talk. Merchants, soldiers, and clerks sat shoulder to shoulder under the low, smoke-stained beams. A spilled drink might lead to an apology, the apology to a shared tale, the tale to a name spoken too carelessly. Laughter could soften suspicion, but it could also sharpen it, especially when a remark lingered long after the speaker had left. Whisper networks had no leader, no scribe to record their minutes. They thrived in the absence of proof, nourished by uncertainty. A single moment, a loaf of bread that failed to rise, a child's fever that refused to break, could be enough to set the first thread moving. Once moving, it tangled with others, knotted itself into shapes that no one person could untie. Those who carried the whispers were often the least suspected. An old man selling onions at the gate, his back bent but his hearing keen. A washerwoman moving between houses with baskets of damp linen. A servant who poured wine and stood silent while others spoke. Their work made them invisible. Their invisibility made them dangerous. Not all who repeated the words believed them. Some passed them on for sport, to see the shape they might take in another's hands. Others did so to belong, to keep their place in the narrow circle that formed when heads bent together. In a city where winters could be long and the nights longer still, stories were another kind of fire, They burned, whether one wished them to or not. There were patterns to the way gossip spread. It tended to follow the flow of goods, from the docks to the markets, from the markets to the kitchens, from the kitchens to the servants' quarters, and then upward to the ears of those who would never set foot in the streets themselves. By the time it reached the high tables, it had been polished, made presentable enough to be spoken over roasted fowl and silver cups. Once in a while, a whisper would falter. It might meet someone who asked for details that could not be supplied. It might reach a house where the door was closed firmly, where the voice beyond replied only, "I've heard nothing of the sort." But these endings were rare. More often, a story grew legs, and those legs carried it through doorways faster than any decree could travel. The accused rarely knew the moment it began. By the time they sensed the change in the air, the words had already passed through too many mouths to be retrieved. They might find the market quieter than before, a greeting cut short, a familiar neighbor turning away under the weight of her basket. The absence of sound was as telling as its presence. Some tried to counter the whispers with open smiles, with acts of generosity more visible than before. They baked extra loaves, offered herbs without payment, greeted even those who did not meet their eyes. But a gift, once offered, could itself become suspect. Why so generous now, unless there was guilt to be softened? The authorities did not need to start the fire. By the time their notice was drawn, the work had been done for them. A scribe would simply record what was already common talk. A magistrate would nod at the mention of a name he had heard thrice in as many days. The trial might still be weeks away, but its outcome had already been written, line by whispered line. And so the city kept speaking, even in its sleep. The shutters closed against the night, but the air between houses still carried the hum of unfinished sentences. In that hum, names and small details drifted together like motes of dust in a slant of sunlight. They did not vanish, even when the bell rang to call the court to order. The whisper networks had no beginning and no true end. They were the marrow of the city, invisible, essential, impossible to remove without breaking the bone. Long after the trial, when the names were no longer spoken aloud, their shape remained, traced in the silence between two neighbors at the pump, in the way a hand lingered too long on a latch before opening the door. And in that pause, where no words were spoken, another story had already begun to form. This one carried not by voices, but by the slow, deliberate steps of a man with a quill. The courtroom had no clock. Time there was measured in smaller ways, by the settling of dust in a narrow shaft of light, by the cooling of ink in the judge's well, by the faint stretch of shadows across the flagstones. It was a place where voices entered reluctantly, as though aware they might never return unchanged. The walls were high and without adornment. A faint smell of wax hung in the air, drawn from the stubs of candles that had burned through long winter hearings. The benches, polished by years of waiting bodies, creaked only when someone shifted, and each creak drew more attention than the words themselves. The accused sat at a plain wooden table, hands resting flat, as though any movement might be taken as confession. Eyes wandered but seldom met. It was safer to study the grain of the wood than the gaze of the judge, whose face remained as unreadable as the heavy folio before him. Clerks moved in measured lines. Their quills made a dry scratching like the legs of insects moving over parchment. They wrote without looking up, capturing each utterance in a hand that was both neat and without personality. The sound of ink meeting paper was the nearest thing to conversation in those hours. No one spoke quickly. When a question was asked, it lingered in the air like steam, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting for the slow construction of an answer. The space between words was deliberate, as though silence itself were part of the evidence. Witnesses arrived one at a time, led to the stand by a bailiff whose boots made soft, deliberate echoes on the stone floor. Some carried themselves with the stiffness of rehearsed truth, others with the loose uncertainty of those who feared they might contradict themselves. A few seemed surprised to find their own words being written down at all. There were no dramatic outbursts, no sudden gasps or raised voices. This was not a theater for performance, but a slow, deliberate distillation. Stories were reduced to their smallest parts: dates, locations, brief gestures. Each detail was placed carefully, like a stone in a low wall, until the wall itself was all that could be seen. The judge rarely interrupted. When he did, it was with a tone so soft it felt more like a reminder than a command. He kept his questions simple. Was it dawn or dusk? Did the bread taste fresh or sour? How many steps from the door to the well? In his hands, the shape of a life became a series of quiet measurements. Those gathered in the back watched with a stillness that could be mistaken for reverence. They leaned forward at certain names, at certain small details that confirmed or contradicted the murmurs already winding through the city. But even then, no one allowed their breath to catch too loudly. The room seemed to absorb such things, as if the walls had learned to keep them from escaping. The accused's voice, when it came, was calm enough to seem detached from the body. They answered without ornament, each word falling into place like a bead on a string. No one knew if this restraint was caution or resignation. It hardly mattered. The room preferred such restraint. It made the work of the scribes easier. Outside, the streets carried the restless noise of carts, of vendors calling their wares, of hammers on wood and metal. But here, the sound did not reach. Only a faint, filtered murmur seeped in when the door opened to admit another pale witness or weary clerk. Once closed, the wood reclaimed the quiet. There were no speeches to stir the heart. Even the final arguments were delivered in the same tempered rhythm, as though aware that any flourish would dissolve before it reached the back wall. The truth, or what passed for it here, was not to be revealed in a single moment. It was to be assembled slowly, like a tapestry woven in muted threads. The verdict did not arrive with ceremony. There was no roll of drums, no pronouncement to carry into the square. The judge looked down at his pages, lifted his head, and spoke in a voice that barely rose above the sound of his own pen. Those closest leaned forward to catch the words. Those at the back simply read the change in the set of shoulders before them. The accused did not move at first. They seemed to take in the decision as one takes in a change of weather, not with surprise, but with the slow understanding that there is nothing to be done about it now. When they finally rose, the bench let out one last sigh beneath them. The clerk closed the folio with care, as though sealing something that should not be touched again. Papers were stacked neatly, ink pots stoppered. The bailiff led the way out, his steps unchanged, neither heavier nor lighter than before. As the room emptied, the light through the high windows shifted. The dust that had hung in its path all afternoon now drifted to settle on empty benches, on the worn stone floor, on the space where the accused had sat. The silence remained, as if it were the true occupant of the room, the one that would stay long after the rest had gone. And outside, the city went on speaking, not with the careful record of the clerks, but in the kitchens, the doorways, the market stalls, reshaping the quiet words of the trial into something sharper or softer, depending on the ear that received them. In that transformation, the judgment took on a second life, one that would never again be so quiet. And in another corner of the city, a single candle burned low over an open page where a different hand began to write its own account of the day. The room was neither large nor small, but measured instead by the reach of the eyes. Walls closed in on 3 sides, and on the 4th, a high window divided the sky into thick, iron squares. Light came through reluctantly, broken into dull shafts that ended before they could warm the floor. The air smelled of damp stone and of the slow decay of wood that had never seen the sun. There was the faint tang of melting candle wax dripping in a thin, uneven stream down a clay holder at the foot of the bed. Each drop landed without sound, but its absence of sound seemed to deepen the quiet. The bed itself was made of straw stuffed into a coarse linen sack. When she shifted her weight, the stalks whispered against each other, like dry grass on a windless afternoon. A single wool blanket lay folded at the edge, its edges frayed, its surface smelling faintly of smoke from another place, another fire. Time here was not kept by clocks. It was counted in the slow work of the shadows as they slid across the wall, paused, and then slipped away into the corners. At night, the moonlight came thin and uncertain, its pale square trembling as it passed through the barred glass. Meals arrived without faces. A hand would set down a wooden tray, and the door would close before she could lift her eyes. Bread that crumbled at the edges, cheese wrapped in a faint wax rind, sometimes a small bowl of stewed beans that cooled before she touched them. Water came in a clay cup, its rim chipped in 2 places. She did not speak much. There was no one to speak to, and the words she might have said did not seem worth the air they would take. Instead, she let her thoughts move like the smoke of a snuffed candle, curling upward and then vanishing before they reached the ceiling. From the window, the city moved on without her. Carts rattled across cobblestones with a rhythm she could almost set to memory. Once, the bells of the cathedral tolled 12 times, their weighty sound rolling in waves through the air until the last echo slipped away. She counted the chimes, then counted the moments after, until silence returned like an old friend. Sometimes she caught the scent of roasting chestnuts, faint but unmistakable, carried by the wind from the market square. It mixed with the sharper smell of tanned leather and the passing sweetness of baking honey cakes. All of it drifted just beyond reach, like a memory she could see but not touch. Days bled into one another. The candle burned lower, its light pooling in soft gold against the wall. The stones held their coolness, no matter how tightly she wrapped herself in the blanket. Her hands learned the shape of the room, the notch in the wall by the bed, the splinter in the table's edge, the smooth dip in the floor where countless feet had turned toward the door. A pigeon nested on the outer ledge of the window. Its wings made a sound like distant cloth being shaken. Sometimes it brought small twigs or scraps of straw in its beak, and once, a bright thread that caught the sunlight for a brief moment. She watched the nest grow, small additions layered with patient care, and wondered if the bird knew it was building under the watch of human eyes. Night brought the sound of rain against the stone. It did not fall in sheets, but in steady, unhurried drops, each one joining the next in a quiet persistence that lasted until morning. The scent of wet earth crept in through the window, mixing with the candle's fading scent. She imagined the streets below glistening in lantern light, the gutters carrying small streams toward the river. She dreamed in fragments, a riverbank in summer, a voice calling her name from behind, the taste of ripe plums warm from the sun. Dreams came without sequence, like pages torn from different books and scattered on the floor. When she woke, they dissolved into the walls, becoming part of the stone's long memory. Once she heard music, faint and likely from a tavern 2 streets away. It was a slow tune, carried on a fiddle with soft percussion beneath. It lasted only a minute, ending as abruptly as it began, but it left behind an ache, as though the silence that followed were heavier than the silence before. Her hands grew accustomed to stillness. She folded them together in her lap, the knuckles pressing lightly against each other. The skin at her wrists grew pale, the veins beneath visible in the candlelight. When she touched the wall beside her bed, she could feel a faint hum, not of sound, but of the stone's own weight, as though it were remembering centuries past. The days grew cooler. From the window came the drifting sight of leaves, their colors deepening before they let go of the branches. Some caught in the wind and circled, others fell straight down, spinning gently before they vanished from view. She imagined them gathering in the corners of courtyards, pressed beneath the soles of hurried boots, or caught in the folds of market awnings. She marked the passing of time, not by how long she had been there, but by the changes she saw in the square of sky. The pale blue of morning, the long burnished glow of evening, the way clouds sometimes stretched thin and pink before fading into gray. When the first frost came, it clung to the bars like sugar. At night, she traced the faint outline of her shadow against the opposite wall. The candle's flame swayed gently, making her silhouette ripple as though it were caught in water. She watched until her eyes grew heavy, until shadow and wall became the same darkness. And always, in the far distance, the city went on breathing. Its markets opened and closed. Its bells marked the hours. Its ovens baked bread. Its rivers carried away the fallen leaves. All of it happened beyond her reach, but not beyond her knowing. She could feel its pulse through the stones beneath her feet. And in the quiet before dawn, a single cartwheel creaked in the street below, rolling toward a place where paper, ink, and careful hands were already at work. The morning began without hurry. Mist lingered low over the rooftops, softening the edges of chimneys and spires. Somewhere a bell tolled the hour, its voice deep and deliberate, as though marking not just time, but the weight of the day itself. She stepped from the threshold, the door closing behind her with a muted thud. Leather soles met stone, and the sound traveled down the empty street in slow, deliberate echoes. No market stalls had yet been opened. The shutters were still drawn, the cloth awnings folded neatly against the walls. Her hands were unbound. There was no guard at her side, only a quiet figure walking several paces behind, his eyes lowered to the cobblestones. The street curved gently, and the mist shifted to reveal the faint glimmer of the river ahead. It was autumn, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke. Somewhere, a chimney exhaled a thin column of white, which rose, wavered, and then dissolved into the pale sky. The leaves in the gutters were crisp and curled, whispering softly when stirred by the passing breeze. Her cloak brushed against her ankles with each step, its hem gathering the dust of the road. A cat crossed her path without looking at her. It moved with the indifference of a creature that understood nothing of human affairs. Its paws made no sound. Its tail swayed once before disappearing into the shadowed mouth of an alley. For a moment, she thought of following it. They passed the baker's door. It was closed, but the faint smell of rising dough slipped through the cracks in the shutters. Once, she had stood in that same doorway, coin in hand, waiting for a loaf still warm from the oven. The memory arrived without bitterness, only with the clarity of something known to be over. The street narrowed. The stones beneath her feet were older here, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Rainwater had left shallow pools in the dips, reflecting a pale wash of morning light. She stepped carefully to avoid them, though she could not have said why. Her shadow stretched ahead, long and slender in the angled light, then drew back into itself as the street turned. They reached the edge of the square. It was larger than she remembered, emptier too. The fountain at its center let out a soft, uneven trickle, the water catching the light in brief flashes. A pair of pigeons pecked at the ground near the base of the basin, then lifted into the air without urgency. Beyond the square, the river waited. It was wide here, its surface shifting in gentle, deliberate currents. Barges moved downstream with the tide, their sails slack in the still air. The smell of the water carried traces of silt and fish, and the faint metallic tang of the chains that moored the boats. They stopped at the bridge. Its stones were worn smooth, the edges rounded by the slow insistence of time. The balustrade bore shallow grooves where hands had rested over the years. She placed her palm there now, feeling the coolness of the stone, the way it seemed to hold the night's chill even in daylight. On the far bank, a row of trees stood bare. Their branches reached upward like open hands, their roots hidden in the damp earth below. Somewhere beyond them, the road continued, a pale thread leading into the countryside. A boat passed beneath the bridge. Its oars dipped and rose in unhurried rhythm, sending ripples outward in concentric rings. The rower did not look up. The sound of the oars was steady, measured like a heartbeat. The ripples reached the stone supports of the bridge and broke softly against them. They began to walk again. The other side of the river was quieter still. The streets were narrower, the houses set close together, their eaves leaning toward each other as if in quiet conversation. A line of laundry hung across one alley, its damp cloth stirring faintly in the breeze. She noticed a window left open, a thin wisp of steam escaping from within. The smell of steeping herbs followed, sharp and green, cut with the faint sweetness of honey. Somewhere inside, water poured from one vessel to another. The sound was small, but it seemed to echo in the morning air. The street turned once more and began to slope upward. Here, the stones were uneven, patched in places with newer work. Weeds grew between them, their roots stubborn, their leaves trembling slightly. She stepped over them without breaking pace. At the top of the slope, a courtyard opened. Its walls were high, its gate made of heavy oak darkened by age. The hinges gave a low, reluctant sound as the guard pushed it open. Inside, the air was still. A single bench sat against one wall, its surface marked with faint carvings, names, dates, a bird scratched in profile. She stood for a moment in the center of the courtyard. The silence felt deeper here, as though the walls had gathered it over years of holding their place. Somewhere above, a shutter closed with a soft clap. A small cluster of leaves circled briefly in the air, then settled against the base of the gate. The guard motioned toward a door. Its wood was pale with wear, the grain smoothed by countless hands. The iron latch was simple, without ornament. She looked at it for a long moment, then stepped forward. The door closed behind her, and the sound was swallowed at once. The room beyond was dim, lit only by the narrow fall of light from a single high window. Dust moved in the air like drifting ash. Somewhere, unseen, water dripped slowly into a basin. And far away, beyond the river's bend, a bell began to call the hour for a different kind of gathering. The fire had long since cooled. Its blackened beams had been carted away, its ash carried off by rain and wind. What remained was neither ruin nor restoration, but something in between, a city resuming its breath, as if nothing had happened, and yet altered all the same. The trial had ended quietly. The hall emptied, its benches creaking one last time before the doors closed for good. Clerks gathered the papers, inking final signatures into registers, folding the testimony into thin packets that would be filed away, out of sight. In the weeks that followed, life arranged itself into familiar shapes. The market returned first. Stalls unfolded in the early light, bright fabrics stretched taut above the tables. Fishmongers laid out their catch, their fingers glistening with scales. Bread sellers brushed flour from their sleeves, setting round loaves in neat rows. Coins passed from hand to hand, the exchange quick, unremarkable. Children traced new games in the dust, marking lines with sticks, their laughter darting between the buildings like small birds. A potter set out fresh bowls to dry in the sun, the clay still damp to the touch. Across the street, a scribe opened his shutters and leaned over the ledge, listening to the sound of the fountain below. But not everything returned. One shop never reopened. Its door remained bolted, its windows filmed over in dust. Once, it had been a place for copper trinkets, small bells, hinges for chests, hooks for hanging pots above the fire. Now, it was only a shadow among livelier neighbors. In the evenings, the river took on the color of molten brass. The barges slid past without hurry, their sails heavy with the day's damp air. Fishermen gathered near the docks, mending their nets in slow, patient movements. From the bridge, one could see the water swirl around its supports, lifting scraps of weed, turning them in endless spirals. Walls, too, seemed to remember. Stone absorbed smoke the way cloth absorbed rain, and even after washing, the scent lingered in the cracks. When the sun warmed them, a faint trace rose, carrying the memory of heat that no longer burned. Those who walked by sometimes paused without knowing why. In the archives, ink faded slowly. Clerks copied what they could before the lines became unreadable. The rest they left in drawers lined with cedar to keep away insects. Names curled at their edges, dates blurred to soft strokes. Some were misfiled, and from then on belonged to the wrong century. A year passed. The baker's apprentices had changed. The eldest now ran the shop, his hands broad and quick. He no longer looked over his shoulder when kneading dough. The old fishmonger had given his stall to his daughter, who called out prices in a clear, steady voice. The square, once so full of whispers, was simply a place to meet again. Lovers sat along the fountain's rim, their knees brushing in the half-light. Merchants haggled over crates of onions, the papery skins rattling in the breeze. The pigeons returned to their place on the high ledges of the church, their heads tilting to the rhythm of the bells. In a small chapel near the edge of the city, a single candle burned every night. No one claimed to know who lit it. Some said it was a habit of the verger, others that it was a vow kept by a family no longer living within the walls. Its flame was steady, even on nights when the wind found its way through the cracks. The old road beyond the bridge grew quieter each season. Grass pushed up between its stones, the edges crumbling toward the ditch. Yet carts still passed now and then, their wheels leaving faint tracks that faded after the next rain. Travelers stopped at the inn and spoke of other cities, places where the air smelled of olives or salt, where the streets were wide and the houses white with lime. The city did not envy them. It kept its narrow lanes, its low doorways, its windows that opened onto each other's shadows. It kept its morning fogs, its evening bells, its market cries, and its quiet courtyards. It kept, too, the things it would not name, the space left in conversations, the glance toward the river before speaking. On certain days, when the light slanted just so, a faint outline could still be seen on the wall near the old copper shop. It was the shape of something once hung there, a sign perhaps, or a notice taken down in haste. The plaster around it was darker, and no amount of scrubbing seemed to erase the contrast. Children, not yet born when the trial ended, pointed at it and asked questions. Their parents gave vague answers, shrugged, and steered them toward the sweet seller's cart. The smell of honey drowned out the curiosity. By evening, the questions were forgotten. And so the city went on. Its roofs collected rain in the same way. Its cats stalked sparrows in the same gardens. Its doors stuck in the damp of early spring. The memory of the fire, the trial, and the names written in fading ink slipped into the same rhythm as all the other forgotten things. But sometimes, in the quiet between the bells, it felt as if the stones themselves were listening, as if they waited for something, not a return, not a reckoning, but a small sound, somewhere far off, that would let them know the streets have emptied and the story has closed its eyes. Let your breath slow, matching the quiet rhythm of the night. The past has folded itself away, and there is nothing left to hold. Feel the weight in your body soften, the air around you grow warm. Let each thought drift like a leaf across still water, unhurried, unbound. The river carries them away, and you remain resting. Close your eyes. The world will keep its watch. You are safe. You are already fading into dreams.